kLa, I think, is a dynamic parameter during fermentation processes. So it varies over time. It's very dependent on your broth composition. It's very dependent on your operational conditions. Be aware of that. Continuously measure it and have multiple sensors whenever possible.
And on top of that, really take into account the fermentation broth and not just water. Do your experiments with broth, not with water. Bubbles behave very different in both.
Hey, smart biotech scientists. Welcome back. We are in the middle of a conversation about mass transfer in bioreactors with Lars Puiman and Volger, who are mass transfer experts from the University of Delft in the Netherlands. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, please go back and listen first to part 1. And today we are continuing our journey. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Brolman, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics and market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. So, what are the key differences in managing mass transfer between, let's say, the lab scale and the industrial lab scale?
Key challenges over here are really operational. First of all, like in the lab, you have a smaller volume and adjusting stirring speed, gas flow rates might be quite cheap. With an industrial scale, you have so much volume, you need a lot of power, and the power consumption might be a significant issue over here. So it's therefore in the lab scale, it's very straightforward to control your DO based upon these characteristics. But in the industrial scale, it's not, because it might be expensive to control it that way. Also, if you control in industry based upon one sensor for dissolved oxygen, it doesn't tell you that much because your reactor can be quite big and the concentration of dissolved oxygen can be different in the bottom than in the top. For example, if you consume your air, then in the bottom you probably have a high concentration of oxygen, while at the top it's lower. This means that the cell continuously sees different concentrations of oxygen. The environment is not that homogeneous anymore as you expect it in the lab scale. That might lead to significant scalar problem.
I'm wondering, out of curiosity, at the large scale, do you guys do also like CFD simulations to understand these differences between the top and the bottom of the bioreactors? Or like, what are your strategies to see these differences?
Yeah, exactly. We are doing a lot of CFD simulations to examine that. So in that, we really model like the whole reactor geometry from top to bottom, put the air in, like at the liquids, and observe whether there is a concentration gradient. And when you see like this dissolved oxygen concentration gradient, you realize that if you only have one sensor at one specific place, it doesn't tell you that much. You need to know more to control this. And what we typically do is, based upon the CFD simulations, we can design lab scale experiments. So we go the other way around. We go from the industrial scale back to the lab scale, and not from the lab scale expect homogeneous environments all the way up. So you have to account for the variations you will see in industry already when you start designing your process.
So there you really take the effort to, at the lab scale already, you kind of hinder your microorganisms with the trouble they will face in the large scale.
So it might be indeed hamper the performance of your microorganism, but it will give you a way more trustful picture for scale up. And that's important because after building such a reactor, before building such a reactor or executing the process, you need to be quite sure whether it works well.
Yeah, that's absolutely key. I mean, you need to be sure that once you're scaling up, that you're able to keep the process and performance similar. I mean, that's absolutely key. And this leads me to another question, because nowadays many people develop processes in microscale systems like the Amber 15 or 250, or even smaller like D-bell plates, do a lot of experience in very small scales, which is great to do a lot of screening and test a lot of media components and so on. But how do we make sure that we are considering the mass transfer aspects early on and also avoiding any issues later on when we're scaling up?
In the smaller scale systems, they are super helpful and good for screening and testing like your different medium compositions and whether the microorganism works well. But yeah, they don't provide any information in this perspective on the concentration differences that you will see in the large scale. So how to tackle that? We have to come up with inventive downscaling systems that could use this. For example, if you have like this Ember 250, you can control the steering speed irregularly. If you vary that, you can already see that if you have this Ember 250 system, you can easily change the steering speed at several moments to account for the concentration fluctuations you will have in the industrial scale. For example, if you increase the steering speed, you would also have a higher DO value. And when you decrease it then again, the DO value will drop. And if you have such differences in steering speed along in your lab scale study, then you would have a better resemblance of your industrial scale operation already in lab scale. Yeah, unfortunately, there is not a single way to do this. Like you have to deal with the heterogeneities that are there in industrial scale, in the lab scale, because typically it's well mixed. That's difficult.
I like that. So the advice I'm hearing, Lars, is that you do these kind of mixing studies and mass transfer studies very early on, as small as possible bioreactor, so that you will not lose any time and you will be able to foresee bigger issues, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, can really help you improve your process.
But at the same time, you would still do CFD simulations, or is this more something you would consider in academia, for instance, or would you consider that as a best practice in a scale-up program of any company?
It's a very best practice. Right now, the CFD simulation would give you the most information on how often the microorganisms see such fluctuations. For that, it's the best tool we have, but it's indeed also a very academic exercise because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to do that. There is some ways with empirical correlations and characteristic times that can be used to have like similar observations, but they lose a bit of the predictive power that CFD has. It's like a shortcut, but the shortcut is not that good.
I think also on the smallest possible scale, there's some recent work in our research group where someone looked at using microfluidics to expose organisms to fluctuations. In that case, you would really be looking at the tiniest possible volumes that you could work with. So in terms of operational expenses on the medium side, that would be a very cheap way to go. But those still have a few of their microfluidic startup issues. There is some cool super micro scale coming up, I think.
Yeah, in these microfluidics, it's also super easy to regulate the concentration fluctuations that microorganisms will see. So it might actually give like a very good resemblance of what it would expect in industry.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's great. So we do have small scale tools at our disposal, and we have tools that will enable us to de-risk the scale up.
Exactly.
So let's circle back now to the large scale. So if we have done our homework, we should be able to scale up our process. Can you walk us through the methods typically used to measure mass transfer rates at the large scale?
Typically, mass transfer is measured in the lab studies. For example, you measure it with the static gassing out method. In that method, you deplete the whole system from air or oxygen using nitrogen, and then you add air again, and then you watch until your dissolved oxygen concentration saturates, and then you can determine kLa based upon this. But in industry, this method assumes that you don't have biomass in your system, so that you don't have consumption of oxygen. But when you have like an industrial operation, it's not very handy to do this method because you have like biomass in your system and the biomass influences your kLa and what Rick told you before, like the highway capacity. We need to account for that. And one of the methods that can be done is the dynamic gassing out method. And it works in a similar way as the static gassing out method, but you only have to account for the gas consumption by the microorganism. Another way to have control on your kLa is via the oxygen transfer rate and also the DO measurements and the solubility you expect in your reactor. Based upon that, you can check whether your kLa is in a reasonable range and whether it varies a lot over time. So what we would argue is that in industrial operation, we should measure kLa constantly, for example, with the dynamic gassing out method, and also by calculating the kLa via the off gases, so we can check its development over time.
And what are the pitfalls to watch out for as we're doing that?
One of the pitfalls might be the calibration of the probe. Some of the DO probes, they might have some drift. And when you have a very long continuous process, the drift might be significant and recalibration might be needed. So good methods for recalibration are indeed very important.
To add to that as well, there's some additions that people do to processes which are more done on they add what is needed. That is, for example, antifoam, but also acid or base are often just added in order to keep the pH constant or to prevent foaming. But to have a good idea of what's happening inside of your vessel and to have a good predictive power, it's also important to know what you've added. So proper quantification of the amounts added of these is essential and I think still often lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding is key. You need to know how it works and how the system is behaving. Now, looking ahead, because we live in exciting times, there are a lot of new bioreactor types, new sensors. There is AI, machine learning, and a lot more to come. How do you think these new innovations will further enhance the process efficiency and also the product quality in bioprocessing?
These advances, they are very interesting, of course, and a lot of research is done and they might as well have a benefit on this. But what I think for now is we should go back to the basics. We should really know what influences kLa. Like have a look at how does your steering speed affect it. Have a look at your process. Know what is going on in your kLa, a mass transfer. And with that, you can already make such a big impact if you steer that well. In terms of the new technologies, I think what we discussed today on CFD and also what Rick said about the microfluidics, that is indeed very interesting to accelerate your scale up.
As we are wrapping up, Lars and Rick, what is the most important takeaway from our conversation today?
kLa, I think, is a dynamic parameter during fermentation processes. So it varies over time. It's very dependent on your broth composition. It's very dependent on your operational conditions. Be aware of that. Continuously measure it and have multiple sensors whenever possible.
And on top of that, really take into account the fermentation broth and not just water. Do your experiments with broth, not with water. Bubbles behave very different in both.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much, Lars and Rick, for all the insights helping us manage mass transfer. Thank you for breaking it down so that everyone can understand it. And where can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can connect to us via LinkedIn, that's for sure. If you can find us there. Looking forward to connect with all the listeners and having conversations when you have more questions or want to go in detail.
Also, if you want to read more in detail, I would advise our recent review, Bubbles and Broth, that goes into specific effects of all these different solutes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I will leave all the links down in the show notes, so please use the resources and please do reach out to Lars and Rick and have a conversation about kLa and mass transfer. And thank you once again for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Hey, smart biotech scientists. I hope you have enjoyed today's conversation with Lars Puiman and Rick Volger, who are mass transfer experts from the University of Delft in the Netherlands. And please tell us what you think about today's episode by leaving a review. And perhaps you still have a lot of questions about mass transfer or in general about developing bioprocesses and then scaling them up into the industrial scale. I want you to help get clarity because you're maybe not even sure what the right program or the right step would be or the right first step to take. I want to offer you a free 30-minute assessment where we're going to walk through your questions and potential roadblocks you may have. It's a 30-minute free assessment, no strings attached. I want to help you get started and be able to master bioprocesses. So if this is for you, just book a free call, use the link in the show notes, and I'll see you on the call. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.